The King has just broken royal protocol. Behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace, an emergency meeting is happening right now that could reshape Britain's political future forever. King Charles has summoned Keir Starmer for urgent talks, and Nigel Farage's name is all over the conversation. The European Union is watching in stunned silence because what's being discussed in that room could trigger a constitutional crisis, unlike anything Britain has seen in decades. This isn't just another political drama, this is the moment everything changes. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace tonight is electric with tension. Sources close to the royal household confirm that King Charles personally requested this meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, bypassing the usual channels and protocols that govern interactions between the monarchy and the government. This alone is extraordinary. The King doesn't simply call emergency meetings, he doesn't intervene in political matters. But tonight, all the rules have been thrown out the window, and the reason why is sending shockwaves through Westminster and Brussels alike. King Charles has allegedly expressed deep concerns about the current state of Britain's relationship with the European Union since taking office. Starmer's government has been quietly negotiating closer ties with Brussels, attempting to smooth over the chaos left behind by years of Brexit battles. But here's where it gets complicated. The King, according to multiple sources, believes these negotiations are moving too fast and conceding too much. He's worried that Britain is sleepwalking into a situation where sovereignty is being traded away piece by piece and the British people aren't being properly consulted about what's happening. Now, you might be thinking, why would the King care about this? Isn't the monarchy supposed to stay neutral? Absolutely correct. But here's the thing. King Charles has always been different. Throughout his decades as Prince of Wales, he was known for privately lobbying ministers on issues he cared about. He sent countless letters to government officials, pushing his views on everything from architecture to environmental policy. These became known as the Black Spider memos because of his distinctive handwriting. Charles has opinions and he's never been shy about sharing them with those in power. The question everyone's asking tonight is whether he's about to cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. The timing of this emergency meeting is absolutely crucial. Just 48 hours ago, Nigel Farage delivered a blistering speech in the House of Commons where he accused Starmer of conducting secret negotiations with the EU behind closed doors. Farage claimed he had evidence that Britain was preparing to accept EU regulations on trade, immigration and even foreign policy without any public debate or parliamentary vote. He called it the greatest betrayal since the original Brexit referendum. The government immediately denied everything, dismissing Farage's claims as conspiracy theories and political grandstanding. But then something unexpected happened. Documents started leaking. These documents, allegedly from within the Foreign Office, appear to show that high-level discussions have indeed been taking place with EU officials. The content is damning. Britain would gradually realign with EU standards in exchange for improved market access and cooperation on security matters. On paper, it might sound reasonable, but the devil is in the details. One leaked memo suggests that Britain could eventually accept oversight from EU courts in specific areas. Another hints at immigration arrangements that would effectively override some of the controls established after Brexit. If these documents are authentic, and most political analysts believe they are, then Farage wasn't exaggerating. This is huge. So where does King Charles fit into all of this? Here's the bombshell. Multiple sources now claim that the King has been in private communication with Nigel Farage. Not official meetings, nothing on the public record, but discreet conversations through intermediaries. Farage apparently reached out to the royal household weeks ago, expressing his concerns about what he was hearing regarding the EU negotiations. He wanted to ensure the King was aware of what was happening because, in Farage's view, the very nature of British sovereignty was at stake. And the King listened. This is where everything becomes incredibly dangerous for Starmer. If it's true that Charles has been taking advice or even just receiving information from Farage, a political opponent of the government, then the constitutional implications are staggering. The monarch is supposed to act only on the advice of the elected government. The Prime Minister is the King's chief advisor. For Charles to be consulting with opposition figures, even informally, breaks every unwritten rule in the British constitutional playbook. It suggests the king doesn't trust his own prime minister. It suggests he's preparing to take action. What could that action be? This is the question that has Westminster gripped with fear tonight. Under normal circumstances, the King's powers are mostly ceremonial. He signs bills into law, he appoints ministers, he opens Parliament, but he does so on the advice of the government. However, and this is critical, the monarch still possesses reserve powers. These are emergency powers that haven't been used in over a century, but technically still exist. The King could, in theory, refuse to sign legislation. He could dissolve Parliament. He could even dismiss a Prime Minister if he believed they were acting against the interests of the nation. These powers are supposed to be theoretical relics of a bygone age, but what if they're about to become very real? Inside tonight's emergency meeting, sources say the conversation is brutal. Starmer is reportedly furious that the King would even entertain discussions with Farage. He's arguing that this is a democratically elected government pursuing a legitimate foreign policy and the monarchy has no right to interfere. But Charles isn't backing down. He's questioning whether the government has been transparent with the British people. He's asking whether these EU negotiations represent the will of the voters who elected Starmer. He's pointing out that Brexit was supposed to mean Britain taking back control, and he wants to know how handing power back to Brussels serves that mandate. The European Union is watching all of this unfold with a mixture of confusion and alarm. Brussels had believed the negotiations with Britain were progressing smoothly. They thought Starmer represented a new chapter, a more cooperative and reasonable Britain after years of chaos under previous governments. Now they're seeing a potential constitutional crisis that could derail everything. EU officials are privately asking whether they can trust any agreement with Britain if the King might simply refuse to approve it. This uncertainty is exactly what the EU has feared most about dealing with Britain: political instability that makes long-term agreements impossible. Nigel Farage, meanwhile, is having the political moment of his life. Whether or not he actually influenced the King, the perception alone is powerful. Farage has spent his entire career positioning himself as the defender of British sovereignty against the European project. Now it appears that even the King might agree with him. Farage's Reform UK party has been surging in the polls recently, and this situation could push them even higher. Conservative voters who felt betrayed by their own party over Brexit are flooding toward Farage. If this crisis escalates, we could be looking at a complete realignment of British politics. Back inside Buckingham Palace, the meeting continues. Starmer knows he's in an impossible position. If he backs down and changes course on the EU negotiations, he looks weak and admits that Farage was right all along. But if he stands firm and ignores the King's concerns, he risks a constitutional confrontation that could tear the country apart. Some advisors are apparently urging Starmer to threaten legislation that would clarify and limit the monarch's powers. Make it clear that the King cannot interfere in democratic governance, but that's incredibly risky too. Any move to diminish the monarchy could spark a massive public backlash. The royal family remains popular with a large segment of the British population, and attacking them could be political suicide. The situation is unprecedented in modern British history. We've had constitutional crises before, but nothing quite like this. The last time a British monarch seriously considered using reserve powers was in the early 20th century, and even then it was resolved without action. What makes tonight different is the combination of factors: a king who has always been politically engaged and opinionated, a prime minister pursuing a controversial foreign policy without clear public mandate, a populist opposition leader who's tapped into genuine public anger about sovereignty and democracy, and underlying all of it, the unresolved tensions from Brexit that never really went away. They just got buried under other issues. The ramifications of what's happening tonight extend far beyond just Starmer and Charles. Every major institution in Britain is being forced to choose sides in a conflict that nobody wanted, but everyone saw coming. The civil service is in turmoil. Senior officials are scrambling to find historical precedents, digging through centuries of constitutional documents to understand what powers the king actually has and what constraints bind him. The problem is that so much of the British Constitution is unwritten, based on conventions and traditions rather than clear legal frameworks. What happens when those conventions break down? What happens when the king and the prime minister fundamentally disagree about the direction of the country? Nobody really knows, and that uncertainty is terrifying. The cabinet is reportedly divided. Some ministers are standing firmly behind Starmer, arguing that this is about defending democracy against royal overreach. They're saying that if the king is allowed to interfere in government policy, then elections become meaningless. What's the point of voting if an unelected monarch can simply veto decisions he doesn't like? But other cabinet members are more cautious. They're whispering that maybe Charles has a point. Maybe the EU negotiations have gone too far, too fast without proper scrutiny. Maybe the government should have been more transparent with the public about what was being discussed with Brussels. These ministers aren't defending the king's right to intervene, but they're questioning whether the government's actions created the space for this intervention to happen. Parliament itself is in chaos. Opposition parties are demanding emergency debates. The Conservatives, still reeling from their election defeat and trying to rebuild under new leadership, are caught in an impossible position. Do they defend the monarchy and implicitly admit that their own Brexit legacy is being betrayed by Starmer? Or do they defend parliamentary sovereignty and side with a Labour government they despise? The Conservative Party is fracturing in real time. Traditional monarchists are lining up behind Charles. Brexit hardliners are cheering him on. But moderate Conservatives who worry about constitutional stability are horrified by what's unfolding. The party that once prided itself on being the guardian of British institutions is discovering it doesn't know which institutions to guard anymore. Nigel Farage is working the media like never before. He's given 3 interviews in the past 2 hours alone, each one more inflammatory than the last. He's not explicitly saying the king is right to intervene because that would be too provocative, even for Farage. Instead, he's framing it differently. He's saying that when a government pursues policies that fundamentally contradict what the people voted for, when they conduct negotiations in secret and try to bind Britain back into European control, then someone needs to stand up and ask the difficult questions. If the elected politicians won't do it, if the opposition isn't strong enough, if the media isn't paying attention, then maybe it takes someone in a unique constitutional position to force the issue into the open. Farage is essentially arguing that Charles is performing a public service by creating this crisis. It's a brilliant piece of political manipulation because it allows Farage to benefit from the chaos without being blamed for causing it. The public reaction is splitting along predictable lines, but with surprising intensity. Social media has exploded. Hashtags supporting both the king and the prime minister are trending simultaneously. Pro-monarchy groups are organising rallies. They're arguing that Charles is defending the will of the people against a political class that never accepted Brexit and has been trying to reverse it by stealth ever since. These supporters see the king as the only person with the authority and the courage to stand up to what they view as an establishment conspiracy. On the other side, pro-democracy activists are horrified. They're pointing out that this is exactly how democracies die. Not through dramatic coups or military intervention, but through institutional actors who decide they know better than the voters and use their power to override democratic decisions. They're warning that if Charles gets away with this, if he successfully intimidates a democratically elected government into changing course, then Britain will have crossed a line it can never uncross. International reactions are pouring in, and they're uniformly negative for Britain. The United States has issued a carefully worded statement expressing support for democratic governance and the rule of law, which is diplomatic language for telling Charles to back off. Washington is deeply worried about British political stability. The UK is America's closest ally in Europe, a crucial partner on everything from intelligence sharing to military cooperation. If Britain descends into constitutional crisis, it weakens the entire Western alliance at a time when global tensions are already dangerously high. The American government has invested heavily in the Starmer administration, seeing it as a return to reliable British leadership after years of chaos. They don't want to see that investment destroyed by royal interference. The European Union's response is more complicated. Publicly, EU officials are saying this is an internal British matter and they won't comment. Privately, they're panicking. The negotiations with Britain were already difficult enough without adding royal drama into the mix. Some EU diplomats are apparently arguing that they should pause all discussions with Britain until this crisis is resolved. They don't want to invest months of work into agreements that might be blocked by the king or overturned if the government falls. Other EU officials see opportunity. They're suggesting that Brussels should offer Starmer public support, perhaps even concessions in the negotiations, to help him survive this crisis. If they can keep Starmer in power and grateful for their help, it might lead to a more favourable long-term relationship with Britain. But this strategy is risky too. If the EU is seen as interfering in British internal politics, it could backfire spectacularly and fuel exactly the kind of anti-European sentiment that led to Brexit in the first place. Back at Buckingham Palace, the meeting is apparently reaching a critical moment. According to sources who claim to have knowledge of what's being discussed, King Charles has put a direct question to Starmer. He's asking whether the Prime Minister will commit to holding a public inquiry or parliamentary debate on the EU negotiations before proceeding any further. Charles wants transparency. He wants the British people to understand what's being proposed and to have their representatives in Parliament vote on it explicitly. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. It's hard to argue against the transparency and democratic accountability. But Starmer knows it's a trap. If he agrees to this demand, he's essentially admitting the king was right to force the issue. He's accepting that the monarchy has the power to compel the government to change its approach to policy. That sets a precedent that future monarchs could exploit. But if Starmer refuses, he's the one who looks like he's hiding something. He becomes the Prime Minister who won't let the people have their say. The legal implications of this standoff are staggering. Constitutional lawyers are being interviewed on every news channel, and they're all saying variations of the same thing. Britain is in uncharted territory. Some are arguing that if Charles actually refuses to sign legislation or takes any formal action against the government's wishes, it would trigger an immediate constitutional crisis that would force Parliament to clarify the monarchy's powers through legislation. This could lead to Britain effectively becoming a republic in all but name, with the king reduced to a purely ceremonial role with absolutely no discretion whatsoever. Other lawyers are pointing out that Charles might not need to take any formal action. The threat alone could be enough. If Starmer believes the king might use his reserve powers, then the Prime Minister might change course simply to avoid that confrontation. In that scenario, the monarchy's power becomes more significant precisely because it remains ambiguous and unused. Intelligence services are reportedly on high alert. This might sound dramatic, but it's true. MI5 and MI6 are monitoring for any signs that foreign powers might try to exploit this crisis. Russia, in particular, would love nothing more than to see Britain tear itself apart over constitutional arguments. Chinese intelligence is probably watching closely too, looking for opportunities to deepen divisions or extract concessions from a weakened British government. Even friendly nations might be tempted to take advantage. When a country is distracted by internal crisis, it becomes vulnerable in ways that adversaries and competitors can exploit. The intelligence community is also watching for domestic threats. There are concerns that extremist groups on both sides of this divide might see this as their moment to act. Political violence in Britain has been rising in recent years, and a constitutional crisis could be the spark that ignites something truly dangerous. Financial markets are reacting badly. The pound has dropped against major currencies. Investors hate uncertainty, and Britain is currently offering nothing but uncertainty. International businesses that were considering investments in the UK are putting plans on hold. They need to know that Britain has a stable government capable of making decisions that will stick. If every major policy might be vetoed by the king or overturned by political chaos, then Britain becomes too risky for long-term investment. The economic consequences of this crisis could be severe and lasting. Britain could find itself facing another period of economic turmoil following so soon after Brexit disruptions and pandemic recovery. The country simply cannot afford another self-inflicted wound. Inside Westminster, rumours are circulating about what happens next. Some MPs are quietly